The first weird occurrence started at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday. Local resident Brandon Johnson woke up after hearing screams coming from his backyard. He lived in a quiet part of town where residents respected each other's rest, so this was odd to say the least. But what Brandon found made him turn pale instantly. But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. The confused homeowner lay beside his bed and looked around, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the sound. His neighborhood watch was thorough, and almost no person who did not belong in their suburbs slipped through the cracks. So who was now screaming so close to his house? Brandon opened the curtains and peeked through his bedroom window to find out. But when he looked, the patio behind his home appeared empty. There were no screams as a response, but the sweeping wind sound that came from his broomstick set in motion something just as frightening. A fumbling sound came from just outside his garden fence, as if somebody had fallen over a set of trash cans or something. Brandon's footsteps moved forward quickly. Behind the property was the place where residents kept their dumpsters, so the sound emanating from behind Brandon's fence made sense. The confused homeowner swung open the wooden door and looked out onto the concrete inner court where the dumpsters were. And that is when things took a turn in a hurry. It was quiet once more, making it seem like Brandon had moved a bit too slowly. "Damn, did I miss it?" Brandon spoke to himself. Brandon looked around and navigated the area that kept the neighborhood trash. Some smaller trash cans had fallen over, so Brandon's guess that someone had gotten scared and knocked them over seemed legitimate. With confidence that who, or whatever was there, was gone, Brandon continued his search. But when he reached his own dumpster, a shiver instantly shot down his spine. What the hell? Brandon and his direct neighbors shared a sizable green dumpster that held enough trash to last them a month before pickup came by. But somehow they always filled it up within a week, and now Brandon finally saw why. There was a door in it that Brandon had never seen before. The dumpster always stood against a brick wall, which covered its backside, and with it, this apparent door. But now that it had moved, Brandon could clearly see a passageway, and it turned out to be open even. Brandon frowned his eyebrows and slowly walked up to the strange metal doorway. "What is this?" With the door open, Brandon saw a large secret compartment in there. It was separate from the part where residents threw in the trash. It had a wooden paneled floor, light fixtures, and even a coffee maker. The place had all the luxuries of a tiny one-bedroom apartment, cramped in the size of a dumpster. Someone was living inside Brandon's trash container, and the thought of that was highly concerning. Brandon was starting to feel unsafe in his own neighborhood, and he did not like that feeling at all. The frightened man stepped out of the metal container and did the only thing he could think of. If his neighborhood watch slipped up and let this intruder slip through the cracks, it was time for the police to take over. Without hesitation, Brandon pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "Hello, is this the police? I want to report a crime that has been committed on my property." The police started out by listening politely to Brandon's complaint, and Brandon felt heard at first. But at the end of his complaint, it quickly became clear that the police were not eager to get involved. They stated that the ground behind Brandon's home was public property, so he had no claiming rights. Also, the police were very busy with actual crimes, so they could not send officers over for such a minor dispute. It also didn't help that Brandon had not yet locked eyes with the trespasser. "We don't even know who to look for, sir." Brandon couldn't argue with that and hung up the phone, disappointed. He understood the police's reasoning, but it didn't make him less afraid and nervous. Someone was living here, and if the police weren't going to help, he needed to confront this person himself. He didn't have to wait long, though, for this confrontation, because just moments later, the following happened. Brandon closed the dumpster door and went back to his house to form a plan when he suddenly felt watched. As a logical response, Brandon turned around instantly, scanning the perimeter to spot any signs of movement. "I know you're still here. Come out and face me, you coward," Brandon shouted, but as expected, there was no response. The broomstick pitted against his garden fence was repositioned in Brandon's hand, and with it, he started walking past the borders of the lot. Brandon tapped the metal fence that shielded the lot from the public road, and when Brandon got to the corner and tapped there, he heard the sound of feet moving. "Got you, you bastard," Brandon said with a careful smirk on his face. The irritated Brandon rushed over to the opening in the fence and made it to the public road as quickly as he could. And there she was. Brandon saw a small female, around 5'2" in height. She looked him straight in the eyes before bolting off around the corner. Everyone in the neighborhood was still asleep, but Brandon was wide awake with proof that somebody who wasn't supposed to be was definitely out there. Brandon could not let her get away, so he took it upon himself to initiate pursuit without hesitation. Brandon only wore the flip-flop he slipped into when he left his bed, but with them, he hurled down the sidewalk at high speed. Within seconds, he himself reached the corner, but to his great regret, the woman who watched him had already disappeared when he arrived. Brandon shouted loudly out of sheer irritation, waking some of the neighborhood residents in the process. It was still early, so they were in their rights to be angry, and Brandon apologized accordingly, but the fact remained that he lost his suspect. Brandon walked back to the dumpster, defeated. There was only one thing left to do: remove the living room setup and lock his dumpster with a padded lock so the squatter could not get in anymore. But something would prevent Brandon from finishing that task. Brandon reached the mysterious dumpster home and was ready to put an end to this horrid night. He had some tools in his shed and was ready to clear out whatever was in there, but only after taking a final look at the interior. I mean, what harm could one final glance do, right? Brandon stepped into the container, not expecting to find anything shocking. It was someone's tiny home, which had already been made clear when he first looked inside. But there was much more to this hidden home than met the eye. Brandon was tall and needed to duck while searching through the dumpster's innards. He saw a tiny couch, a pull-out model that could be turned into a bed at night. In addition to the rest of the basic necessities, he also saw a few picture frames. Brandon picked up one of them and held it close to the door opening so the outside street light could illuminate the photo. There was a middle-aged woman with long blonde hair on it and a young girl who stood beside her. Brandon's eyes squinted, and something inside of him told him that this person looked familiar. But who was she? He presumed that the person in the picture was the woman owning the dumpster home, but based on the individual he had just chased through the neighborhood, he could not say they looked alike. The small, dirty-looking individual he chased looked much older and had more salt and pepper-colored hair. But Brandon was not granted much time to calmly think about the comparison, because then the following thing happened. The moment he lowered the picture frame and looked outside the dumpster, he got a major fright. The woman he had chased down the streets had returned, and this time she looked angry. She held the door to the container in her hand, and with it, she would turn the table on her hunter. Brandon knew what she was about to do and pleaded with her to stop her next action, but it was already too late for him. The woman grunted deeply one time and then proceeded to slam the dumpster door shut, locking Brandon inside. It was now pitch black all around Brandon. As he shouted for the woman to let him out, Brandon repeatedly fell over pieces of makeshift furniture. "Please, lady, I meant you no harm. You must understand that finding out someone is living inside your dumpster causes an initial sense of panic. I just wanted answers as to why." Brandon used all the pleading words he could think of, but the woman who locked him inside was stubborn. She was in control now. After a while, Brandon gave up. Using the flashlight on his phone, he started going through the container. He knew she was likely just outside the door. Still, he chose not to provoke her. Instead, he searched through drawers and under furniture, trying to figure out who she was. Inside a makeshift nightstand, he found a book. It wasn't just any book, it was a personal journal. Doodles and handwriting revealed it belonged to the woman. The name Linda appeared repeatedly, and something about that name sparked a memory. Suddenly, everything became clear. Brandon recognized her from a photo inside the journal. It portrayed the same salt and pepper-haired woman who had just locked him in. He no longer needed confirmation. He knew who she was. Brandon approached the dumpster door and gently addressed her, expressing sorrow and regret. If his hunch was right, he might have been able to prevent what had happened to her. There was a pause before the door slowly opened. A streetlight shone in, momentarily blinding Brandon. When his eyes adjusted, he saw a tearful woman. "Do you recognize me now?" she asked. He nodded and asked, "You are Linda Andrews, right?" She confirmed it. Though Brandon had never known her personally, her name was well known in the neighborhood. Linda had once been a single mother living nearby. After divorcing her husband, She struggled to support herself and her daughter, working 3 jobs but still falling behind. Eventually, the neighborhood called a meeting. Brandon remembered it well. A neighbor had criticized Linda's unkempt house and overgrown garden, saying it reflected poorly on the community. Brandon had defended her, highlighting her difficult situation. But in the end, the majority voted to remove her from the neighborhood. After being evicted, Linda was blacklisted as a tenant and became homeless. She sent her daughter to live with relatives and tried surviving on the streets, but the city was harsh. Maintaining hygiene became impossible, and she lost her job. In desperation, she returned to the neighborhood she once called home. She discovered the dumpsters had hidden compartments and quietly made one her shelter. She chose Brandon specifically, remembering he had been the only one to speak in her defense. After hearing all this, Brandon did something unexpected. He hugged her, offered help, and invited her to stay in his guest room. With stability and support, Linda quickly turned her life around. She looked healthier, found a new job, and eventually moved into a small apartment. Her daughter returned, and for the first time in a long while, Linda looked forward to the future. See how a bit of understanding could make a massive difference in someone's life.